Thank you everyone for coming to today's Fosway 9-grid for digital learning Ask the Analyst session. This session is hosted by me, Martin Cousins. I'm head of content, and I am joined, and I will introduce my fellow panelists in a while. Firstly, for those of you who don't know about Fosway Group, we are Europe's #1 industry analyst. We cover HR, talent and learning, and we work with large organisations, and we spend a lot of time researching the market and the vendors within it. I'm also joined in the background and in the chat. You'll see my colleague Jack is there. So if you've got any technical questions, please do speak to Jack. And I would just now like to introduce our panel. We've got David Wilson, who's the CEO of Fosway Group, and David Perring, the Director of Research. And today you will be known as the two Davids. And thanks both for joining today. And Ian, if we can just go to the next slide. So this is just literally how we're going to roll today. I've said a bit of this already, but please use the chat to ask questions. We are going to have an overview of the 9-grid, and then we will get into questions in about 15 minutes time. We've probably got quite a few vendors here today, so please say who you are, and let's play nicely. And I think we'll then come back at the end and wrap up. But what I would say is that we do get a lot of questions, so please do ask them as we go. I will pose them to the panel when we get to the Q&A, and if we don't get to answer your question, then we will endeavour to do that afterwards, and we really do try and do that, so we get lots of questions, and we can't fit them all in today, but we will try our best. So without further ado, Mr. Wilson, I'm going to pass over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, and thanks everybody for joining us today. And hope you find the session interesting. As Martin said, I mean, the point of these is to give you a chance to ask us questions, and David obviously is lead analyst on digital learning, and for me potentially to be able to answer those as best we can. One of the things we like to do quickly before we go actually into the 9-grids is just kind of provide a bit of context about where they come from, where the data is, etc. So apologies if you've heard this before, in terms of the either for digital learning last year or for one of the other 9-grids. Each of the research processes around a 9-grid is a bit of a monster. We've been running them for a long time. Digital learning was one of the early topics that we did in 2014. I think the first version was actually published, and continues to evolve every year, continues to get much bigger every year, and we work really hard to make sure we get stronger inputs every year in terms of being able to obviously come to the best view of the vendors and their different capabilities and performance. We get insights from all sorts of different directions. Most particularly, obviously, we're focusing on inputs from the customers themselves, particularly from the corporate research network members. So the organizations that engage with us typically frequently and over a longer period of time, but also from obviously things like private advisory work that we do, and from the wider corporate inquiries. Plus we also get inputs from our public research process, surveys, things like our learning realities research, for example. And then obviously from a very structured process that we run with vendors themselves, including functional and non-functional type information, briefings with them, demonstrations, meetings, etc., and a formal customer referencing customer process that piggybacks that as well. So overall, we end up with a huge amount of data that we get in. Every year we zero base this, so we actually rebuild effectively that data from scratch and look at it based on and assess vendors based on the capabilities in that year, making sure we track it. Next slide, please. One of the questions we often get asked is who gets to go on the 9-grids, you know, how do you get on it? I mean, the simple answer is based on that corporate research network, so the typically larger organizations, you know, who are they actively using already? Who are they actively considering to use or in some kind of buying process with? And then obviously to some degree, when you're looking at things like the innovator players, they haven't necessarily achieved that yet. So who do we think has the potential to achieve those things? So it's very much based on a filter view relevant to our target buyer, which is an EMEA headquartered corporate, large enterprise, medium or large enterprise, or the EMEA end of a global organization. This is not a pay-for-play. Vendors can't buy their way onto the 9-grid or buy their way off it or decline to be included. It's just based on who we see based on those criteria above. Next. The input, as we've said, is very much shaped by the customer view. So the dominant view that we always have, and in particular, you'll see this when we start talking about things like performance and so on, where obviously things like actual customer advocacy or not has a really big impact in terms of how we will rate people on that. But the primary view is the view from the customer end. We do a lot of vendor input as well, but it's very much used to cross-validate those assumptions. Sometimes, for example, to identify new capabilities or from mergers and acquisitions type activity where they're not. And also we, to cross-validate where they are in terms of their roadmap and what they've delivered and so on within the year period. The market's moving very, very fast, so clearly we need to do that as much as we can. But as I said, it's really dominated by the input we get from customers, and we get a lot of input around the vendors, as you can imagine, across the course of the year as well as in the cycle. So we've got thousands of data points typically that we're looking to do, and we try and then synthesize that all together around it, validate assumptions around the trends going on in the market, which David will kind of touch on in a minute, and then obviously then try and distill that down into the 5 dimensions of the 9-grid positioning. I know obviously all of you are aware of probably the diagram, the matrix, the 9-grid itself. One of the things we always recommend though is that you actually download and read the full reports. Not least because it has some kind of interesting information around the variables that we're actually looking at. In this case, obviously, what makes up a digital learning vendor and how we assess them, but also the key trends. So nothing here is being looked at in isolation. Obviously, when we're rating the ability of vendors to serve corporate needs, we have to understand how those corporate needs are changing. So looking at the market trends and solution trends is really important. And there's a lot of useful information within that trend sections, and we find people like to reference that specifically actually sometimes as well. So read the full report if you can do. There's also an introduction guide if you want to understand more about the structural model around the 9-grid and what's behind it as well. There's also a link in that full report that can take you to that document as well. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to David, who's going to talk to you a bit more specifically around digital learning, and then we'll go into the 9-grid and the questions.
So thank you, David. So one of the things that people always ask us is, what is a digital learning provider? And I think over the last, since 2014, the picture has evolved in the way that we've looked at the marketplace. Back in the day, we would have thought, actually, who can create just some bespoke digital learning for you? But we've tried to broaden the scope as actually the remit around digital learning has expanded as well, and try and think of this not just about who can create some bespoke learning, but who can be a digital learning provider almost across a complete range of services, almost be that go-to conversation of who can help me transform my learning function to be a truly effective digital learning team. And that really enables us to think about the digital learning experiences, be that classic e-learning or adaptive learning or gamified learning, or just-in-time performance support learning. Really try and build out that sort of sense of, it's not just the formal learning experiences, but the workplace learning experiences and the collaborative learning experiences. Also, who's got the platforms that can provide and support those range of experiences, who can provide you with the consulting to give you maybe some strategic view of how you should position and build your ecosystem of solutions, who can provide you maybe with services, so that actually rather than maybe growing your own team of digital learning experts and digital learning creators, that they can be an extension to your team. And that could be about production, it could be about back office maintenance, it could be about systems maintenance and configuration. And then there's just that other layer of who are you engaging with to provide thought leadership that helps you think about the next gateways and next staging posts around digital learning that enable you to stay ahead of the curve. And when we're looking at digital learning providers, they typically have maybe 2 or more of those functionalities that we're looking to explore. And it's something that sort of is something that's very much in the round. Some people are able to offer a few elements, others offer a broader set. And that's really reflected often in the chart. So when we look at the 9 grid, typically we'll see people who offer a broader range, maybe all different 5 parts of those sort of dimensions. At the higher end, with those who maybe only offer the learning experience and maybe some thought leadership, quite often being at the lower end of the spectrum when we look at the vertical axis of the chart. So that's pretty much the dimensions that we consider, and it's really about the ability of your partner to be a transformative digital learning partner for you today and tomorrow. And that's where we've sort of taken this from just being about bespoke learning and who can do a bespoke project for me into who can look at all these things wrapped together, which is a broad brief, right? Now, this year in terms of the grid, this is what we tried to put into the matrix, so to speak, and just to sort of reflect on some key headlines around the grid itself, which we've highlighted in the report itself. But I think the first one is just this sense of it is boom time, or still boom time as a result of the pandemic for digital learning. And I think one of the critical stats that we've picked up over the last year has been that only 2% said that they will take or revert their learning organisation back to what it was before the pandemic. And most of those people who were in our survey, they've moved even deeper into digital learning. And what we try to do is reflect that in the grid. There's a little bit in the pattern that you see in front of you, that's sort of expressed there. But it's very much, I think, we're trying to reflect this sense of even very small organisations are finding some way to get digital learning into their organisation. And that's driven from all the things around rapid change, but also this sense of having a hybrid and distance workforce. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, despite typically organisations having maybe 3, 4, 5, 10 years plus sometimes an experience of digital learning, most are still only at a base level around their solutions. Less than a third in our latest survey in our digital learning realities, which we've got links and we'll talk about later, say that they are mature in their use of digital learning today. And there's sort of all the things that you might think we should be more advanced around, like mobile, coaching, performance support, micro-learning, social channels. People are still exploring and trying to find out how to do them effectively. And so there is this sort of entry-level view. We're pretty solid on using classic e-learning and the natural switch from classroom to virtual classroom. Those things predominate. That's where people tend to be more confident and feel they've got maybe more intermediate and advanced skills. But if you look at some of the more emerging themes which are driving more effective learning experiences, things like adaptive learning, learning games, maybe more immersive learning approaches, typically only 10% are saying that they're advanced in those sorts of more maybe advanced solutions. And I think that sort of maybe plays into this sense of the digital learning fatigue. Again, from our survey, around half of organisations highlight digital learning fatigue as an issue. Around half say that they believe their learning systems aren't fit for the modern workforce. So that there is an area almost of actually the sorts of experiences that we need to offer need to be above the baseline, enable us to overcome some of the issues around digital learning fatigue. And part of that is a transition and a big move and a big focus for many organisations to think more about how they look about learning through work or learning in the workspace, in the workplace. And that seems to be pretty much a non-negotiable probably for the next couple of years in particular. About 90% of our latest survey respondents from L&D say they want to enhance the quality of learning in the workflow or in the workplace, but only 10% say they're advanced in doing that. So this sense of almost shifting away from some of the more traditional approaches and thinking about how you create a richer learning experience which is focused not just on one phase delivery but on more spaced repetition and a better blend is where things are going, and then how you enable that. And that almost links into that sort of last bullet point in the key headlines around skills driving transformation. Actually, most of the things that we're seeing across HR in the broadest sense that are really driving a lot of learning and a lot of growth in learning have been from things like talent mobility and skills, and the surfacing of career options for individuals within organizations in that space. And that seems to be driving a pull for learning from outside of the traditional learning platforms, and it's driving a new wave. So those are some of the key headlines. I won't dwell on them too much, but hopefully that sort of picks out. David Wilson, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to highlight from your perspective around some of those points. You're on mute.
Unmute, schoolboy error.
Okay.
I think the main thing is obviously that as David said, there's been a significant acceleration in the market because of the pandemic. Everything had to go digital. The sophistication of the solutions being delivered hasn't necessarily accelerated that much or at all, and that's leading to some of those other factors. I think the other thing is just in terms of our process this year, we've made a very strong effort to also go hunting to look at who were we missing. So there's some interesting new additions into it. I mean, the criteria, as we said, we sort of constantly look at it each year about how we're judging those, but also looking for who else, particularly some of the regional players in Europe who we feel that are also kind of setting benchmarks in their local markets and have the aspiration to be more international as well. So it gets increasingly crowded. But I think it's still, trying to work out who really, who does what kind of scope of work can they do, and who do they really serve well, and then obviously trying to then map that across the whole of the thing. So no, I think let's go into the questions maybe, and then we'll see where that takes us.
Cool.
Great. So now, please do put some questions in the chat. I've got a couple that I'd like to get started with, but this is everyone's opportunity to kind of pose some questions to the two Davids, but I'll go first. So in terms of that grid and the shape of it, I'd just like to ask you to reflect a bit on where the vendors are positioned and what this says about the market as a whole, because they're sort of top right if you look at them as a whole. So what does that mean? What's that telling us? If you'd like to start.
Do you want to put the grid up actually, just for a bit? I mean, one of the things we've decided to do this time is not just always leave the slides up, because it's sometimes useful to actually hear it. But I mean, David, why don't you talk a bit about the shape of it a little bit more, and maybe some of the new entrants as well, because I think that's also quite interesting in that.
So just to explain it, in terms of the positioning within a box, that represents an organization's trajectory. And typically the trajectory is, in terms of vertical axis around potential, is about a growth in functionality, so a range of services or solutions and capability, but also service capability, so their global reach, maybe their depth of support that they can offer. And then on the right hand side, there's that sense of momentum. So are people shortlisting them? Are they buying them, and are they really happy with the sorts of outcomes that they are driving? And I think that sort of right and upwardness within the grid is probably reflective, I think, of that sort of boom time comment, that sense of actually there is a genuine momentum within the market space around digital learning. As I said before, there's very few organizations that haven't embraced digital learning and embracing it deeper and further than they've ever done before, as a result of the impact of the pandemic, and in particular things like hybrid working. And that has driven people to make decisions around how they partner. And that has meant that actually even people in the past, like say Hemsley Fraser, have made a bigger focus away from their classroom training into being more virtualized. And equally with people like Sagos, for example, who are a new addition, and we've been tracking them for a while, their portfolio has always had a strong accent around digital learning, but actually that's increased in momentum in the market space as well. And that's, I think what we try to do is show just this overall shift of actually the market is really pushing the boundaries. People are struggling, or what should I say, challenging themselves around the sorts of solutions that they are implementing. They're bringing more innovation into the space as well, thinking about things like spaced learning, thinking about things like adaptive learning, thinking about things like performance support in new ways, thinking about how we create truly transformational learning for individuals. And I think that's really what we're trying to capture here, is this sort of sense of momentum in the marketplace. If it was slowing down, we might see things maybe transition a bit more to the left.
Yeah, I think the other thing I was going to add in there is, so, I mean, the thing about this 9-grid particularly is it's very diverse in terms of the types of organizations we're talking about. You know, some of them have come very much from being bespoke e-learning, bespoke content providers. Others are content aggregators, or off-the-shelf content providers that have then built out other solutions. Some of them are also service companies, learning aggregators that maybe do managed services and so on. David referenced Hemsley there, NIIT. LTG now also incorporates GP Strategies, obviously having acquired that last year as well. So it's quite a complex landscape, and the challenge always with this is understanding what we're comparing here in terms of the vendors. But go back to that lens David talked about in terms of the sort of 5 areas around experience, the service capability, consulting, thought leadership, etc., and so on. So I think whilst what we're finding is, whilst there is a diverse set of capabilities that those organizations may have come from, in reality, over time, you tend to see organizations, when you go and say, who are your strategic partners for digital learning, that becomes much more mixed at the customer end as well. So I think that's an important point. The other thing which I referenced earlier as well, which is some of the new entrants here, including some of the sort of more regional boutique providers, or somebody that comes in. So we've had someone like Mintra, for example, has been in there with and Atlas knowledge before, as somebody who specifically worked in oil and gas, but now we've also got other organizations, somebody Intuition that did a lot of stuff in financial services, and then a wider set of corporate capabilities. But you've also got other organizations coming in like Junction 18 and so on, plus some regional players as well. So I think it's quite a complex and diverse landscape.
Great. And I think we've had some questions, so thank you everyone for posing them. We'll start off with just a couple of grid questions. One from Rob about just the difference between a potential performer and a solid performer.
Shall I go for
that?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, the key thing around potential performers is generally what that is new entrants. And it could be actually new entrants to Europe. They could be an established player in another market like the US or somewhere. And but they have yet to build. So they're coming in. They're relatively nascent in terms of their capability, but they're also nascent in terms of their corporate history, right? In terms of Europe. So one of the things that you tend to find is, and again, it comes back to the overall assessment. If when they're left side, it tends to indicate often their early stage in terms of their growth within the European market, or the alternative is it can be established players that have a very much more mixed picture from a customer advocacy. As I said, the customer viewpoint dominates a lot. The performance that when we're looking at potential performance, solid performer, that's a left to right kind of comparison. So that's ultimately around market and customer performance. The more established somebody is, the more they've got proven track record, the more they start to move right. So in essence, what you're looking at in potential performer is often sort of newer or niche players, but ones that have now been in the market for a period of time. They've got an established track record. There's a certain amount of corporate awareness around them and buying history, and there's a kind of more obvious advocacy story or not. And sometimes people can get pushed back. You know, they can have somebody who was a strong performer, but maybe they hit a blip and then end up with a you know, some negative customer things, and that can apply at every level. I mean, we've had that before with strategic leaders that actually got pushed right back into potential leader box because they, you know, they went through a period of lots of change and a lot of customer uncertainty.
David Perry, would you add anything to that?
I think just everybody on the grid is a solid choice, right? And I think that's something to re-emphasize in terms of the range of people that we look at. Actually, when we put them on the grid, we think they're a viable option. And just because somebody's on the left-hand side of the grid doesn't mean they're not a good choice. Sometimes the people on the left-hand side can be the keenest, most eager to please, and interesting partners to pursue. They may have some limitations around their ability to scale. They may have some limitations about their resource depth sometimes, but that's something you can manage as a partner. So if you're a big buyer, partner with a small organization, you have to know when you're going to overstretch them, and that's something that needs to be managed. So the grid is as much about managing the opportunities or managing the partnership as it is about trying to select and choose people. We're just trying to say, this is where they're up to. If you want to engage with these guys, they're a good choice. Just think carefully about how you don't burn them out potentially if you come the sort of with 100,000 employee just to work with a small organization of 2 or 3 people, right? You could burn them out, but you can manage that as part of your engagement with them. It's not saying you should not work with them.
Great. So next question is another grid question from Denise, and I just wanted to, sorry, while I'm flicking through 2 screens here, just picking up on brand awareness. So David Wilson, you're talking a bit about this. You know, are we using brand awareness in the performance, and how do we measure that? So you're kind of beginning to pick up on that.
Yeah. So we'll,
previous answer.
And again, read the report because it talks about the criteria specifically. But basically, the performance axis, the left to right, is based on what we call market and customer performance. So in crude terms, if you think about that through a buying cycle, it's, you know, who are the corporates looking at? You know, who's on their long list, who's on their short list, who's in, if they're RFPing, who's on the RFP, who's on the final 2, who's winning. That's, so there is something about the market performance, and then ultimately, of course, that's then into their delivery and execution. So how well do they execute, and what's the end advocacy picture like? And it's quite interesting when you talk to, you know, the corporates, even ones that come through, for example, the referencing part of the vendor process is often, you know, that you get a much more mixed picture than, you know, the vendors probably think that they're going to give us around what it is. I think one of the things around, we've always tried to do at Fosway right from the very beginning is to just create a very honest, transparent conversation around this, and sort of open the kimono a bit and really understand what that experience is beneath it. It's not based on superficial kind of scores. It's really trying to get real insight onto what somebody really thinks, how successful, and also, you know, to some degree at what scope you can, and that's the challenge. Often you hear people talk about stories around making decisions or global rollouts, and you actually know that only a small proportion of their audience still is using it yet, and things like this. So trying to understand what's really going on, that makes a real difference. So the size is more about their overall kind of size and influence in the market to some degree, including, remember, this is all weighted towards an EMEA-centric buyer. So somebody can be a very large player in the US, but have almost no presence here. So you've got that difference thing around the presence that they have in the market, typically reflecting their size and influence versus, you know, but if you've got somebody that's a niche player that there's very high awareness of and lots of people are looking at them, they might be quite small, but still have quite a strong market performance input.
And just to add to that, there's a lot of conversations that we have with corporates who have been involved in digital learning for 20 plus years. People that we know and trust as people who are innovators and really experienced in delivering digital learning and making it effective. And the conversations that we have with them around who are you seeing that's interesting? Why have you chosen these guys that maybe a little bit more off our radar? Where has that gone? So that sort of customer view, to some extent it is brand awareness, but almost a step removed, because we're talking to these people who have that responsibility and have the level of experience that we respect and take as being sort of thought leaders in their own right. And we try and reflect that back through the grid. as well.
That's an important point, actually. With digital learning, is typically people have a set of providers that they use, and what's interesting there is quite often they will have, you know, some mainstream choices, but then what you might call a rogue choice, you know, somebody that is very small or very niche or only operates in their space, or they have historic personal relationships with, so they understand what their capability is. And it's really common within the digital learning landscape to find that if somebody's working with a basket, you know, we used to talk about preferred supplier lists and all this kind of stuff. Often a lot of the work didn't go to the big ones. It went to some of the niche ones who are really tuned into what that company needed to be successful.
Okay.
So we are trying to surface the voice of the customer, and it comes through formal surveying, but also conversations that we have with trusted partners, the people who actually own those deliverables in some key organizations which have an international global footprint.
Yeah, great. Now we've got, I'm sort of trying to bunch some of the grid questions because there are a set of trend type questions as well. So, I mean, we've got a question about a vendor, and the reason I'm going to ask it is because it's a large vendor. Yeah. So, and in a market that's seeing a lot of acquisition, then maybe there's some relevance here around William's asking about LTG. Looks like it's a strategic leader, looks like a strategic leader, but does LTG exist as a real service provider versus, let's go back to my question, versus a portfolio company with distinct operating brands?
So LTG is a holding entity, right? So it's a financial entity. And it's kind of interesting when you go back to the kind of history of this. Obviously they have multiple sub-brands, and in fact they've actually tried to sort of simplify and move that brand landscape down, because we used to have lots of sub ones around Gomo and Preloaded and things, even within their kind of portfolio, plus then People Fluent, and then Bridge and etc., now GP Strategies, etc. What we try to do is look at LTG kind of holistically. And in some ways, if we looked at an individual sub-brand, I mean, we would end up with five entries for them, which we don't really want to do. Sometimes we've done that. We do have vendors in some of the 9 grids where we have multiple entries on, where they're very discrete operating brands that are quite disconnected. But I think with LTG, it was around looking at it as a holistic capability. So typically Leo was, of course, a kind of over window that was pulling together some of the small niche brands as well. And then obviously we are now with GP Strategies looking at the combination of that whole thing. It is absolutely fair comment to say, is it really a single entry, single brand? But we actually, in fact, in an early day, we had a conversation with them, I think in one of the earlier 9 grids when they first made the transition, and they said, well, we want to be on there branded as Leo. So, well, if we're going to assess you as Leo, we'll put you in a different place. So, we felt that I still think it's probably the best way to reflect that capability. Whether longer term, it does depend on ultimately how their brand landscape manifests itself, and it could be more relevant to include, for example, GP Strategies, which is a huge thing in its own right. It depends on how that business evolves. Is that a fair comment, David?
I think that's spot on, to be honest. I think that echoes exactly my feelings around it too.
Okay, so let's look at some of the trends. I think, is it Jan or Jan? Forgive me if I've got that wrong. We've got a question here about how does the trend towards blended learning affect the grid? Will we create a blended learning grid?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? And I think what we've tried to do through the history is almost make it a blended learning grid, if that makes sense. So all the transition from when we originally did this in 2014, when it was just about bespoke learning, the whole reason for trying to stretch out that brief and that scope so that it also includes platform and consulting and outsourced services, along with off-the-shelf content and bespoke content, is to almost say that almost pushes you in the direction of blend. And that's what we've tried to do. So we could call it a blended learning grid, but there is a strong accent around the technology here. So that's where we've sort of really formatted it down to digital learning, because it's almost digital learning led. It's a digital learning led blend, typically. That's the way I think about it, but it's a great question.
David Wilson, any other thoughts?
No, I think that's spot on.
Yeah,
I mean, and we actually, there was an evolutionary point. We went from bespoke e-learning to bespoke learning solutions ultimately into digital learning. And what you've seen is a fragmentation of what was considered, digital learning, from, traditional e-learning through to a myriad of different types. And obviously when we talk about blend, that's a blend of digital as well as a blend of digital and non-digital, right, as well.
Yeah.
So and I think, particularly when you come back to that point, that statement, David, so who makes a transformative partner? It's the ability to be able to kind of build an anchor and build experiences in that real world scenario, rather than just point delivery of one thing. But there are obviously specialists in there that just focus on one thing. But I mean, ultimately, I think the digital learning has always been about how, a more solutions orientated, and led by typically people that have focused on content and service, but enabled by platform rather than led by platform, because typically that's where we would, if somebody is purely led by a platform, then we would probably look at them in a learning systems context.
Yeah, but there's some really interesting evolution, I think, in the grid itself. So we've started to pick up and start to examine solutions or providers that can provide maybe a coaching layer around their digital transformation. We're really interested in those conversations with the corporate buyers who say, yeah, I needed to take this group, or say, for example, of procurement transactors, people who in the procurement team who just took the order and did the processing, and we wanted to transform them into procurement business partners. Actually, there's a whole journey of skill development within those people to enable them to fulfill those roles. So that's the sort of journeys we're sort of trying to hook into when we understand the ability for people to execute around digital learning now, is actually how can you help an organization change itself from what it used to do into what it should be doing or wants to do in the future.
Yeah. The other thing is, I'm guessing Jan is actually JJ.
Yeah.
So if that is, then but the other thing I was just going to say is that thing about blended is going to really change a lot. I mean, it's quite interesting looking at Skillsoft's evolution, and with the acquisition now of the acquisition of, for example, coaching companies, and the merger with Global Knowledge, for example, and creating a kind of blended delivery model. And it's interesting, I'm always going back to when I first set off Fosway in the late 90s, and when we first had the evolution, I wrote a paper in 2000 talking about how we saw the market happening. One of the things we predicted was that it would be very difficult for a lot of classroom training companies to transition and become really blended, because it was too problematic for their business model. And actually it would take e-businesses to acquire training businesses for that to really truly happen, and potentially we could be on the cusp of that change really manifesting itself. And it's, there have been elements of that in the past, but not necessarily at the scale that we're seeing with some of these things now.
Definitely.
Right. So I also want to pick up on a question related to what you were just talking about, David Perring, this is from Peter. Do you see a move from content consumption to truly engaging action-oriented learning journeys? So I think you started to pick up on that.
I think there's such a broad diversity of digital learning experiences that people can start to explore. And we've always used, probably for the last 12 years, this image of almost like a petal diagram, which has a segment around formal delivery, a segment around workplace learning, and a segment around collaboration, and each of them overlap. And that probably starts to show the breadth of experiences that people can explore. And I think Peter's spot on, right, in terms of, I think there is going to be a move to more immersive learning. We know that the costs around that have fallen, and the benefits that organizations have achieved from immersive learning are really significant, especially in some of the most unexpected places, right? So frontline workers who maybe work in retail food outlets, having virtualized training around how you stack the shelves, how you deal with customers, in that sort of virtual experience, the impact on those business. And if you do a search on Itsu, for example, on YouTube, you will see some really interesting things on the benefits that they got from using a more immersive approach to learning, not only in terms of the business outcomes, but the ability for people to stay longer in those roles. So I think for particular sorts of programs. We're going to see that stretch out. I think we're going to see also stronger use of diagnostic tools. We're seeing already the growth in things of skills inference to help guide people around their career paths. We're seeing things around adaptive learning become more interesting, micro learning, and that sense of spaced repetition driving more interest, gamified learning, linked to maybe learning scenarios, taking more interesting, the whole thing around branched learning and how that works. All these things are probably stacking up a little bit in terms of it's no longer enough for certain instances in certain contexts just to provide the traditional page turning. And that's excluding all of the stuff around, so how do you create greater performance support resources? How do you nudge people with the micro learning nuggets just to say, keep yourself topped up? So the diversity around solutions, I think, is one of the challenges of the market space overall.
I think though one other point I make, maybe controversial, is I think we massively overplay the word experience all the time, and I think this is a problem much wider than learning. I mean, it's true within the wider HR things. We keep talking about, you know, people experience and all this kind of stuff. And I think the thing around it within the learning context is that it's sort of a bit in the eye of the beholder. You know, people look at it and go, "Oh, this is a great experience," but in reality, what they're talking about is was it easy to use? Did it feel nice? You know, in terms of the experience around it, as opposed to, did I learn anything? Could I do my job better? Or some of the other things that you'd really think about. So I think in some ways experience is a bit of a throwaway word. It's easy to keep adding it to the end of things and assuming that now is that it's a great thing. But I mean, in reality, you know, focusing on it being a better experience is a good one, but it actually being a better experience doesn't make it a great experience, right? And I think we need to look at that a little bit more holistically. But as David talked about, you've seen this massive fragmentation in terms of the strategies and tools and approaches that you can use to put together. And ultimately, it's around, you know, the individual pieces of that working well, but it also holistic in context works well within as you put the pieces together. And that's often where things have fallen apart in the past. You've had e-learning content that hasn't aligned with, you know, classroom content and hasn't aligned with the coaching support they were getting around it before. So the whole point is, when to create a stronger real experience, it has to all connect and gel.
And that's just within the definition of the learning experience, let alone then the learning process, so to speak. So was that process driven by career development? Was it driven by talent mobility? Was it driven by performance management? Was it driven by performance support and feedback? All those things also come into play. So it's a multi-dimensional matrix. And that's why I think trying to find the right partners to give you the right input is becoming so critical, and why we've almost sort of moved the dial a little bit beyond just bespoke, because there are so many layers to this, which isn't even just about content created. It's about actually how do you empower that social content creation so you capture the best in your team, that they use that as part of the learning process to share with others. So also that sort of sharing and collaborative learning approach is important as well, and that's makes it again a complicated conversation about, so what's the right sort of learning solution for that organisation in that context for that audience.
So can I just come back, this is a slightly off script, but David Wilson, I think you've started something in my mind, so I just wanted to pick this up. So you're talking almost about the ecosystem there. How do you get all these different elements to work effectively? So how do you begin to do that?
Well, I think it's actually a bit more multidimensional even than the ecosystem, right? Because it's almost the blend within the blend, and so you've got all of the components that you're trying to connect together, and as David said, for different contexts, right? So somebody who is just trying to solve a specific problem today has a very different engagement into that than how do I reskill and transition an organization? How do I build strategic capability in the business? How do I build somebody's career? You know, development is an anchor pillar within the talent story, but how do I map onto that and really support it in an effective way? And I think that the interesting thing about the pandemic, it made all of that basically in play for digital. Historically, that was there were some organizations that had pushed the boundaries into all of those areas, but actually the vast majority hadn't. They were still using it for compliance and basic kind of knowledge, skill acquisition type stuff. They weren't really using it for anything that profound from a development perspective. Well, COVID changed all of that, right? Because if you didn't support it digitally, you weren't doing it at all. So I think from a point of view of now you've got that much more diverse landscape you're dealing with, you then have to think about from an ecosystem perspective. Bear in mind, this is not just about learning. Learning fits into wider talent, HR, and work ecosystem as well. And then we're thinking about it then from a learning design point of view. So what David was talking around there was really, how do I bring the different modalities, the different approaches together across that diverse ecosystem and across those different contexts. So it's a very multi-dimensional problem to do well, and it's hard to do it well, really, for one thing, let alone for many things, right? And that's ultimately what you're trying to do with things. So hence, that's why organizations will always have a set of partners that use certain things for different things, because certain contexts, certain knowledge, certain capabilities would lead them towards working with vendor A rather than vendor B.
Okay. Dave Perring, would you add anything to that?
No, I think that's spot on. I'm glad you asked David.
Right. So I'm just going to come back to a question about that relates to one of the trends, which was learning in the workflow. Laura's asking, do you have any thoughts on how badged or accredited micro-credentials may work alongside that theme of learning in the workflow?
It's a really interesting part of the story. I think it really is dependent on your audience and the importance of credentialing within that audience and within your organization, whether that's to prove expertise, and you've got some pay scale related to, you can only sell this product unless you have this level of expertise, so we reward you more. If it's not part of a broader whole, most of the surveys that we've got, and we've got some running currently, show that badgification to some extent and that micro-credentialing is not a top driver for the vast majority of learning teams. So you have to be, I think, very tuned into the right scenario and the right audience. But we've heard of really interesting examples. I spoke to the guys at HPE, Hewlett Packard Education, and they do the training for their technical staff. They always used micro-credentialing and credentialing as a way of steering their sales teams to the next most interesting products, because you had to pass your credentialing in order to move on to be able to sell the next products. And that was almost a pull to shift the organization to develop itself as well. So within the right audiences, it can work really well, but it's not something that we see organizations more generally see as something that is routine. It seems to be a bit more audience and situation specific.
Okay. David Wilson, would you have any?
No.
Okay, so a question from Robert. It's all about more on the data side. To what extent are clients interested in the data about their learners that they get from the vendors? I'd like to go first with that.
I can't stop myself jumping in, because I think that they should be super interested in the data. The data should be something that is foundational. It is something that's really important, especially if you think about how you target and engage and think about the personalization of learning. Without the data, that cannot be achieved. I think there's a lack of maturity within buyers overall and their architectures to handle that data. If it doesn't fit within their systems, there's a significant limitation within the systems to manage that data as well. And what I mean by that is the ability to express itself as a relationship management system, like you would get if you were working in talent management talent acquisition, where when you're after a candidate, you use the system to really leverage that relationship and speed up the process to get them engaged. And that's something that I think is systematically missing, probably about in 99% of learning platforms. They see themselves as a platform where people go, rather than necessarily see themselves as a platform which creates a relationship. And I think that's a fundamental flaw within the systems, which affects almost every other part of the experience overall, to be honest. So that's me venting my spleen on that.
I think there's
there's
another interesting angle to all of this as well, which is around efficacy and impact. Right. So, I mean, going back again 20 years, having conversations with people as they were transitioning classroom training onto e-learning, and you go, okay, so what's the impact of doing that? And they go, well, you know, it was cheaper for us to deliver. And I would turn around and say, well, why don't you just stop doing it? Because if you can't prove it's adding any value, then if you stop doing it, you'd get an infinite return on investment. Surely that's a better thing. You have to be able to prove that it works somehow, right? So, and I don't mean creating a full ROI study on something, right? It needs to be contextually relevant to what you're trying to do. But at the end of the day, the other thing, what also matters is, does this make a difference? Does it enable them to move forward? Does it enable them to do their job better? If you don't have data underneath that, you don't have a story, right? You don't have any understanding on it. And I think it doesn't actually matter what the context is, whether the focus is on discovery and allowing people just to kind of learn whatever they want, right? You still need to understand what's effective and how you align investment. Somebody's still paying for that somewhere, right? They still have to understand what's going to drive value for that audience. So even if your motive is more around employee engagement, for example, you still need to understand what that is. If your motive is around performance improvement and an operational performance, you clearly need to know that, because if you don't know how it impacts it, you're clearly not doing a good job, right? That's and that's one of the reasons why L&D has struggled in the past sometimes to justify budgets. It's sometimes seen as a slush fund, because at the end of the day, it was measuring itself on happy sheets and engagement scores, not on outcomes. The more strategic you want to be, the more that you need that data as well. So I think, for both in terms of understanding how the best way of doing things around optimizing the experience for people, personalizing recommendations, personalizing learning paths, right, and giving choice within there. All of this is underpinned by a data story, and if you don't have it, you're kind of nowhere.
And I think most of the most interesting stories about the impact of data, so if you go through the guys at Rustici, you've been doing their LRS things that they did with Barclaycard, which is sort of, you get snippets when you do searches on the internet. The impact that's had, and for example, the guys at Learning Pool, when they had HT2 Labs and their LRS, and showing with Villeroy Bosch the impact of learning on the people who sales. And they were able to almost A/B test to say, these are the people who haven't had training, this is how good their sales are, this is the B group, and this is how good their sales are, because they've been doing training and doing learning. Those things have a lot of impact. And like the guys at Xonify, they do a similar thing around trying to link the individual data to the business data to show the outcome and guide the learning conversation. And that's outside of all the things that you could do, for example, with the adaptive learning platforms, who start to understand what things you're getting right and wrong to present you with the next nugget of learning that you need to go through. So it has such a vast impact, but there has been almost a universal disconnect of business data from learning data, and some of that's for privacy reasons, but actually it's just an oversight.
I think it does create an interesting question as well for L&D teams around how able they are to engage in that conversation, and where they are able to take it forward and to be a leader in it. It's hard, you know, again, it's hard to see that if you're not able to drive that conversation and have the skills to support it, you're at best a fast follower, probably a laggard in terms of what's going on. And that's in the current climate, where the level of pressure on L&D to change, evolve, support the business going through kind of unparalleled changes. That's not, you know, it's not a good place to be. And I think that's also the challenge. What we've seen is digital learning, or digital in learning, go from being very much a niche to become the lead, right? And we talked about digitally enabled blends, for example, and things. And hybrid workforce kind of makes this non-negotiable. You know, if you've got a hybrid workforce, unless you have something that's effectively a digitally enabled blend or a digitally enabled experience around it, you're immediately excluding people from participation, right? And that creates employer liability, not least, when you're with things. So I think this stuff is something that the stakes have got much higher.
Yeah. So look, we've got a few minutes left, and I'm hoping Paul was asking a question about assessing the learning experience. I'm hoping actually within the answers you've just given that there is, I think you've given quite a steer around that. Two questions left.
Yep.
First one is just William is talking about the fact that he's David Wilson. He heard you talk about blockchain a while ago. And he's just asking the question, what technological innovation is going to drive seismic change through digital learning? Is there one? That's my first question.
Well, I mean, first of all, AI, the use of AI and machine learning within content and within tools, right? So making the content more intelligent, making it more adaptive. I think, you know, adaptive learning is something we've been looking at for 15, 20 years. And the technology to deliver it, frankly, was kind of historically clunky and really expensive to be able to do it. And I think we're getting to the point where that's starting to transition. And that's a real game changer. If you can imagine that as you go through content or as you go through a learning path or program that is kind of self-adapting based on your, you know, your performance, your preferences, your job role, your work, your whatever, I think, so that embedding intelligence within things is probably the biggest game changer around it, rather than just, you know, a specific technology stuff. I think, I mean, there are roles for things like blockchain, you know, in terms of providing evidence trail. Provenance matters, right? So there's some real challenges around, I mean, certifications, for example, and how transportable those are across organizations between things. You know, do you trust people when they tell you they've got certain qualifications or not, and so on and things like this. So I think there's a lot of, you know, there's potential for micro credentialing around that as well, as we touched on a little bit earlier. But yeah, I think probably the embedding of intelligence within not just the systems, the things that you use to engage with the choices and learning you have, but also within the learning itself.
And the production of learning as well,
yeah.
Right? So you can put some put some content to a learning engine, and it will start to generate, these are the sorts of key topics, and here are the questions that I will ask as part of the micro learning environment that I'll create for that particular journey.
That's really interesting. You know, taking pre-existing content, for example, and then deconstructing it through something like that, which would enable you to drive a much more adaptive, almost question-led or need-led kind of approach to it, rather than this kind of click and turn, move to the next regardless of relevance or knowledge.
Right, so look, one final, very quick answer, please. But where's the hype in digital learning? What do we need to be aware of?
There's a lot of hype in the word experience, generally. I mean, I think there's a lot of hype in flow of work. You know, we know that there's a lot of interest in surfacing learning through workspace environments, you know, Teams and so on, Slack, etc. But they're also fairly horrible environments to learn in, you know, and I think that, you know, so you've got to think about the reality of that. So flow of work could turn out to be a really big one, but the reality of is, you know, and we talked about this again 15 years ago, around the most important thing was to be able to integrate learning within a work context, because learning is part of work and vice versa. So it's not that that concept is wrong, but the manifestation of it at the moment is pretty, may turn out to be not very effective.
I think that's a little bit linked to one of Peter's questions around, do you see the move to content consumption to truly engaging learning? I think it's not hype, but I think the direction I'd hope that the organizations and the market goes into is about trying to create that more human, more action-orientated learning, where actually the technology is not only a channel to deliver learning, but also part of the nudge and the process and the coaching itself that encourages people to go on their journeys and keep themselves at the right pace around the insights they need to have as well.
Right. Now it's the bell is chiming for 4 o'clock here in the UK, so we're going to just wrap this up quickly. I just want to kind of say again that this, as you've seen, there's a lot of data here, and we spend a lot of time researching the market and using our data and our tools to help corporates. And you can see there that some of the outcomes that we see through our work. So if you are interested in working with us, then please do get in touch. Next slide, Ian. And we've been sharing some of the links in the chat, and I'd just like to say that that's where you can find the report, our digital learning realities research. I'd encourage you to participate in that. That's what David Perring is overseeing, and that's still live. I'd like to thank today's panel, the two Davids, David Perring and David Wilson, and I would like to thank you all for attending today and for asking some great questions. I know we've got 2 or 3 that we haven't answered, and we will definitely follow up after this session and send you those answers. But from all of us at Fosway, thank you for today.